I should have asked more questions. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not because asking would have changed anything. I don't think it would have. But because I'm the sort of person who asks questions for a living, and I didn't ask a single one that mattered. The call came on a Wednesday in late October. A woman from the site coordination office in Ankara, English good enough that she didn't stumble, told me the epigrapher currently assigned to the Çatalhöyük dig had withdrawn due to a health matter, and that my name had been put forward as a replacement. She said the team needed someone with Neolithic symbolic systems experience, and that my publication record made me a strong fit. She said the position would begin in 10 days if I was available. She said all of this in the same tone you'd use to discuss a change in catering arrangements. I said yes. I didn't ask what kind of health matter. I didn't ask who had put my name forward. I didn't ask why the replacement timeline was 10 days instead of the start of the next field season, which would have been the sensible approach. I had 11 years at Durham, a decent stack of published work on pre-Neolithic Anatolian symbolic systems, and no particular reason to be suspicious of a phone call offering me a dig I'd have applied for anyway. So I said yes, I wrote down the logistics, and I started packing. That's my way of saying the story starts before I arrived. I just didn't know it yet. The Konya Plain in early November is the kind of flat that makes you feel slightly exposed, like the landscape is doing nothing to help you. I'd worked in Turkey before, a survey project near Göbekli Tepe in 2017, a documentation stint at a site outside Ankara before that. But the Central Plateau is its own thing. The sky sits very low and very gray, and the ground is hard and pale, and the two mounds at Çatalhöyük rise out of it like they've been waiting there longer than the surrounding country has any right to claim, which, depending on how you count, they have. The drive from Konya took just under an hour. The site driver, a quiet man who introduced himself only as Mehmet, didn't say much beyond asking once whether I'd been to the site before. I said no. He nodded and drove. The mounds appeared on the right side of the road before I expected them. Not dramatic, not the way a site looks in photographs. Just two low rises against the flat, the excavation shelters visible as dark shapes against the gray. I had my field jacket on already and my kit bag between my feet, and I was thinking about the level 12 eastern sections I'd been briefed on. The painted plaster documentation that apparently needed systematic UV survey. I was thinking about work. I wasn't thinking about anything else. The accommodation block was a low prefab structure set back from the main excavation area, functional in the way that field housing always is, meaning it worked and nothing more. Narrow corridors, doors with name slips in plastic holders, shared kitchen at the far end that smelled permanently of instant coffee and whatever someone had cooked 3 days prior. The site coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Berna, who managed logistics with the focused energy of someone who had been managing them for too long, walked me down the corridor and pointed out my room. Third door on the left. My name was already in the holder, printed on a slip of paper, slightly crooked. I dropped my bag, looked at the room, single bed, small desk, shelf above it, window facing the mound, and went back out to find the kitchen and introduce myself to whoever was around. There were 4 other team members in that week, plus Lloyd, who I hadn't met yet. A geophysics postdoc from Utrecht named Peter, who talked quickly and ate standing up. 2 excavation specialists from Istanbul, whose names I got wrong twice before they stuck. A finds coordinator from Edinburgh called Sandra, who'd been at the site 3 seasons, and who gave me the kind of look that means she'd seen replacements come through before and had learned not to invest early. Fair enough. I asked, because it seemed natural to ask, whether Garrett had left anything useful, notes, a preliminary symbol catalog, anything that would help me pick up where he'd left off. Sandra set down her mug. There wasn't much to leave, she said. He wasn't here long. How long? She thought about it. 3 weeks, maybe. He got sick. It was quick. I said something like that was a shame and asked if his notes had been filed anywhere accessible. She said she didn't think so, and the conversation moved on, and I let it move on because I had no reason not to. It was 2 days later that I noticed it. Not deliberately. I wasn't looking. I was trying to find the linen cupboard, which Berna had mentioned was at the far end of the corridor past the last room, and I walked the full length of it reading the name slips out of mild curiosity the way you do when you're new somewhere and still mapping the place. Peter van der Berg, Sandra Holt, Kemal Arslan, Deniz Yildiz. My own name, slightly crooked, and then the linen cupboard. I stood there for a moment, counted back, 5 names, including mine. 5 rooms occupied. The corridor had 8 doors. I went back and looked at the 3 that had no slips in their holders. One of them had a small square of discoloration on the door where a holder had been removed, the paint slightly brighter in a rectangle the size of a name card, the way paint looks when something's been taken off a wall that had been there long enough to matter. The shelf inside, when I opened the door, was clean. Not dusty clean, wiped clean. The bed was stripped to the mattress, and the mattress had no indentation, no compression, nothing that said a person had slept on it for 3 weeks. I closed the door and went and found the linen cupboard and stood in front of it for longer than I needed to. 3 weeks. Garrett had been here 3 weeks. There should have been something. A forgotten adapter, a book, a coffee ring on the desk, the kind of residue a person leaves without meaning to. There was nothing. Not even the absence of things. The room had been returned to a state that said no one had ever been assigned to it at all. I filed it away. That's what I did. I noted it the way I note an anomalous symbol, cataloged it, set it aside, kept moving. It didn't fit the explanation I'd been given, but I didn't have enough to build anything from it yet, and I had work to start and a team to get to know and a UV survey to plan. So I filed it and said nothing. Looking back, that was the first thing I should have pulled on. I didn't. The briefing happened on Friday morning, the end of my first week. Lloyd ran them in the main site office, a larger prefab with maps on every wall and a long table that was never quite big enough for everyone. I'd met him by then, briefly. He was the kind of man who fills a room without trying, tall and broad and carrying that particular brand of authority that comes from decades of being the most senior person in any given space. He'd introduced himself with his full title, Dr. Lee Lloyd, Stanford, and shaken my hand with the grip of someone who had shaken a great many hands and knew it. The briefing was routine. Excavation progress on the southern mound, geophysics updates from Peter, a discussion about the level 12 eastern sections that confirmed I'd be starting UV documentation the following Monday. I was taking notes. The room smelled like coffee and damp canvas. Quinn arrived 8 minutes late. I hadn't been introduced to her yet. She came in without apologizing for the interruption, set a clipboard on the table, and waited for Lloyd to pause. He didn't pause. She waited another moment and then spoke anyway. "I need to flag a ministry requirement before we go further," she said. Her English was precise, slightly formal in the way that second language fluency sometimes is. All personal electronic devices, phones, tablets, recording equipment must be registered with the ministry's site log before entering any excavation chamber. This is effective immediately. Lloyd looked at her the way you look at a noise that hasn't stopped. "Gale," he said. "We've discussed the registration protocols. The team is compliant. The requirement has been updated," she said. "Registration before each entry, not at the start of the season. That's not practical. It's a ministry requirement." Lloyd held her gaze for a moment, then turned back to the table. "We'll address the logistics separately. Moving on." And he moved on, and the briefing continued, and that was that. I wrote it down. Device registration, ministry, Quinn. And then I turned the page and wrote notes about the UV survey and forgot about it entirely. 2 details, neither connected, both already pointing at something I wasn't ready to see. The eastern wall of level 12 smelled like chalk and old water. That's the first thing I remember about it. Not the discovery, not what came after, just that smell. chalk and cold water and something underneath both of them that I never quite identified. Mineral. Ancient. The kind of smell that doesn't have a name because nobody's needed one. I'd been assigned the plaster survey as standard documentation work. Nothing exciting about it. You photograph the wall surface in sections, log the condition of the plaster, note any pigment degradation or structural cracking, move to the next section. I'd done it 100 times at a dozen sites. The UV lamp was just part of the kit. You run it across the surface because sometimes pigment that's invisible in natural light shows up under ultraviolet, faded ochre, or lime wash that the eye misses. Most of the time you get nothing. Sometimes you get a faint geometric border or a handprint the visible light survey missed. Useful, but not dramatic. I was working the third section from the north end, maybe 1.5 meters above the floor. My knees were already sore from crouching. The lamp was in my left hand, the camera hanging from my neck, and I was doing the thing you do after a few hours of documentation work, where your brain goes slightly elsewhere and your hands just carry on. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That's probably why I caught it. The UV light picked up something in the lower section of the wall, just above the floor line. Not pigment, not a surface marking. Something below the surface, a shadow almost, but sharp-edged in a way that shadows aren't. I stopped moving the lamp and held it steady and leaned in. Carved lines, angular. Running in columns, tight and regular, descending from about 40 centimeters above the floor, straight down to the floor itself. And this is the part that took me a moment to process. Continuing below it. The columns didn't stop at the level 12 floor. They kept going. The site maps showed solid substrate below that level. Not a chamber, not a continuation of the occupation layer. Solid. These symbols were carved into something that was supposed to be nothing. I put the camera up and took the first photograph without really deciding to. Then I took 12 more. Here's the thing about working in Neolithic iconography for as long as I had. You build a vocabulary. Not just from Çatalhöyük, from every comparable site across the Anatolian Plateau, from Göbekli Tepe, from Nevali Chori, from a dozen smaller sites that never made the popular press. 40 years of documented material, give or take, and I'd cataloged most of it in one form or another. Geometric symbols, anthropomorphic figures, hunting scenes, the particular way a certain type of chevron appears and reappears across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years. You know this vocabulary the way you know the streets of a city you've lived in a long time. You might not be able to name every alley, but you know when you're somewhere you've never been. I had never been anywhere near these symbols. The angular forms were consistent, not random, not decorative in the way you'd expect from surface ornamentation. They had the look of something that meant something specific, the kind of density you see in functional inscription rather than symbolic decoration. The columns were regular enough that I counted them, 7 across the visible section, each one descending with the same spacing, the same character height, the same depth of cut. Whoever had carved these had done it carefully, with intention, over a long time, or with considerable practice. Maybe both. I spent another 40 minutes with the lamp, working the floor line, trying to see how far down the columns went. I couldn't tell. The floor itself was solid, and without breaking through it, I couldn't follow the inscription further. I photographed everything I could reach. Then I packed up the kit, walked back to the accommodation block, and sat on the edge of my bed for a while without taking my jacket off. I brought the photographs to Lloyd the next morning, printed, because I wanted him to see them at actual size rather than on a screen he could minimize. His office was the largest room in the site's administrative section, which still wasn't large. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of binders, a wall map of the excavation grid with color-coded pins. Lloyd was already at his desk when I knocked. He was the kind of man who was always already at his desk, which I'd taken as a mark of professionalism but was starting to think might just be a way of controlling who came to him versus who he went to. I laid the photographs out in sequence. 3 rows left to right, showing the full section from the north end of the wall down to the floor line and the continuation below. I explained what I'd found, where, and how. UV survey, lower wall section, the symbols running below the level 12 floor into substrate that the site maps showed as solid. I kept it factual. I'd been careful with the framing of the prints to show the floor line clearly so he could see the columns continuing through it. Lloyd looked at the photographs for a long time, not in the way you look at something that surprises you, not leaning forward, not asking questions, not reaching for one to look more closely. He stood still and looked at them the way you look at something you already know is there but were hoping not to see confirmed. That's the only way I can describe it. His hands were flat on the desk and he didn't move them. He didn't say anything for long enough that I started to feel like I should say something to fill it. I didn't. I'd spent 11 years in academic departments. I knew the difference between someone thinking and someone deciding. Eventually he said, "Where exactly in the eastern wall?" I told him. "Third section from the north, lower register, specific grid coordinates." He nodded once, slowly. "I'll have someone look at the structural condition of that section." That was it. That was the whole response. I gathered the photographs. He didn't ask to keep them, which told me something on its own. I walked back out into the corridor and stood there for a moment in the cold, which was always there. The site never really warmed up in November, and I thought, well, I didn't think anything coherent. I just stood there. The next morning, Lloyd announced at the briefing that the eastern wall section of level 12 was showing signs of structural instability and that access was suspended pending a safety survey. He said it the same way he said everything, with the flat authority of someone who doesn't expect to be questioned. Nobody questioned him. The survey would be scheduled, he said, once the engineering team had assessed the timeline. I waited a week. No survey was scheduled. I asked one of the site assistants, casually, whether she'd heard anything about the level 12 safety assessment. She hadn't. I asked again after another few days. Different person. Same answer. The thing about suppression, and I want to be clear that I'm calling it that, not caution or protocol or administrative delay. The thing about suppression is that it only makes sense as a response if you already know what you're suppressing. Curiosity doesn't close a wall section. Uncertainty doesn't close a wall section. What closes a wall section is knowing what's behind it and deciding nobody else should get there. Lloyd had looked at those photographs and recognized something, not with surprise, with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for that thing to surface and had already decided what he would do when it did. I still had the photographs. I'd kept copies, printed and digital both, which I don't think Lloyd had considered because he hadn't asked for them and hadn't told me to delete anything. Maybe he assumed I would. Maybe he assumed the closed wall and the absent survey would be enough. The symbols were still down there. The columns still ran below the level 12 floor into substrate the map said was solid. Whatever was below that floor, whatever those symbols were carved into, whatever they were carved for, it hadn't gone anywhere just because Lloyd had put a closure notice on the wall section. I knew I was going back. I think I'd known it since I was standing in that corridor outside his office. I just needed a few more days to admit it to myself and work out when. Thursday evening. The site quieted early on Thursdays. I'd noticed that in the first week without thinking much of it. The kind of thing you file away without knowing why. Thursday evening then. Thursday came around and I went. That's not quite right. I didn't just go, like I'd decided on a whim. I'd spent 3 days working up to it, telling myself I was being careful when really I was just scared and needed the time to get past it. I'd watched the site pattern. I'd checked which evenings the accommodation block emptied out, and when the last of the dig staff usually drifted toward the mess tent. Thursdays, the way I'd clocked it in that first week, the site went quiet early. No particular reason I ever worked out, just one of those rhythms a place develops. By 7, the paths between the excavation zones were empty. The portable lights in the western trenches switched off, and the only movement was usually Quinn doing her last equipment check of the week, which kept her in the storage annex off the main compound for the better part of an hour. I knew all of that. I'd been paying attention without meaning to, the way you do when something's bothering you and your brain won't leave it alone. I went at 7:30. Headlamp, UV lamp, my field notebook, and my phone. I told myself the notebook was professional habit. Really, it was because I didn't entirely trust the phone anymore, not after what had happened in Lloyd's office. That look he'd given the photographs, long and careful and completely still, the look of a man reading something he already knew the ending to. The eastern wall section had a closure notice taped to the wooden barrier they'd put across the passage entrance. Yellow paper, Lloyd's signature at the bottom, structural assessment pending. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I ducked under the barrier and kept walking. The UV lamp picked up the symbols immediately. They were exactly where I'd left them. Of course they were. I don't know what I expected. They'd been there for however long they'd been there. They weren't going anywhere on my account. But there was still something that loosened in my chest when the lamp caught the first column and the angular lines came up sharp and clear against the plaster. Still there, still real. I hadn't imagined it. I followed them down. The columns ran to the floor the same as before, but I got lower this time, crouched right down with the UV lamp angled into the seam where the wall met the level 12 floor, and that's when I saw the gap. Not a crack. A gap, maybe 40 centimeters across, where the floor substrate had either broken away or, and this is the thing I kept coming back to later, had never been filled in. The symbols continued through it, down into the dark below. I lay flat on the floor of the passage with my headlamp pointing into the gap and looked. There was a chamber below. I don't have a clean way to describe what it felt like to see that, so I won't try. I just lay there for a moment with my cheek against the cold floor and looked at the top edge of a carved wall maybe 1.5 meters below me. And then I found the handholds. There were handholds, worn smooth, cut into the substrate at the edge of the gap, which I noticed and then immediately stopped thinking about because thinking about it meant thinking about who had cut them and when and how many times they'd been used. And I went down. 4 meters, give or take. I measured it after by the length of rope I'd have needed, working it out in my head on the way back up. 4 meters below level 12's floor, which put me somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years before the Neolithic occupation above me. That's not a number that means much until you're standing in it. Then it means everything. The chamber was roughly 8 meters across, irregular shape, low ceiling that came down toward the far wall. And the walls, floor to ceiling, every surface I could reach with the lamp. The same angular symbols in the same tight columns, but denser here, packed closer, running in directions that didn't follow the vertical the way the level 12 carvings had. Some of the columns curved. Some intersected. I stood in the middle of it and turned slowly with the UV lamp, and I genuinely could not find a section of wall that hadn't been worked. I wrote Chamber 7 North in my notebook, gave it a designation the way I would any excavation context, because that's what my training told me to do when everything else my training had prepared me for had just stopped applying. At the center of the chamber was a stone platform, roughly knee-height, maybe 1.5 meters long natural rock that had been shaped, not carved into anything representational, just leveled and worked smooth on the upper surface. And in the surface, 2 grooves, parallel, curved, each one about the width of a wrist. They were worn. Not cut-worn, not tool-worn. Worn the way a wooden step gets worn when enough people have used it for long enough. That organic smoothing that happens when something soft moves against something hard over an enormous amount of time. I put my own wrist in one of the grooves. It fit. I took it out again fairly quickly. I wrote down the dimensions. I wrote down the groove spacing. I kept writing because it was the only thing that felt like solid ground. Then I heard it. Low. Below what you'd call a sound, almost. More like something your chest registers before your ears do. I stood still and waited, and it came again. 4 beats, evenly spaced, and then silence. I counted the silence. 11 seconds. Then 4 beats again. It was coming from a fissure in the bedrock at the far end of the chamber, a vertical crack maybe 10 centimeters wide running floor to ceiling. I crossed to it and held my hand near the opening and felt nothing. No air movement, no temperature differential, just the pulse, regular and low, somewhere below 80 hertz, if I had to put a number on it. I've been near enough geological phenomena in fieldwork to know what ground settling sounds like, what water through limestone sounds like, what gas seepage sounds like. This wasn't any of those. The spacing was too consistent. 4 beats, 11 seconds, 4 beats, 11 seconds. Not varying by more than a fraction across the time I stood there. I got my phone out and opened the audio recorder. I recorded 17 seconds. I know it was 17 because I watched the counter. Then the screen went dark. I pressed the side button. Nothing. I held it. Nothing. The battery indicator had shown 64% when I'd come down through the gap. I'd checked it specifically because I'd wanted to know how long I had for photographs. 64% doesn't die in 17 seconds. It doesn't die in 17 minutes under normal use. I stood in the dark with a dead phone and a UV lamp and a notebook, and the pulse kept coming. 4 beats, silence, 4 beats. And I made myself breathe steadily and think about what I needed to do next. I photographed what I could with the UV lamp held close to the wall sections, using the lamp itself to light the frame since the phone was gone. Not ideal, not nothing. I filled 6 pages of the notebook. Symbol tracings, rough dimensions, the groove measurements, a sketch of the chamber layout, a note about the fissure location and the pulse interval. I wrote the number 11 in the margin and circled it 3 times, which isn't something I usually do, but I wanted to remember exactly how certain I'd been about the count. Then I went back up through the gap, under the barrier, out through the passage, and across the empty site to the accommodation block. I sat on my bunk for a while with the dead phone in my hand. The UV lamp was on the floor. My notebook was open on my knee. I'd found a chamber that didn't exist on any official map, sitting in a stratum that predated everything above it by a margin that rewrote the timeline of human presence at this site, at any site in this region, if I was being honest about what the depth implied. The walls were covered in a symbol system I couldn't identify. The platform at the center had been used repeatedly by something with wrists. And in the bedrock, something was still producing a rhythmic pulse at 11-second intervals, regular enough to set a watch by, and it had drained my phone battery in 17 seconds flat. I turned the phone over in my hands. The screen stayed dark. Whatever was down there, it wasn't finished. The week after I found Chamber 7 North, I tried to be methodical about it. That's my way of saying I tried to pretend I was doing normal work while doing something that was very much not normal work. I had the photographs on my phone, the phone I'd charged back to full overnight, which took it no problem, as if nothing had happened. And I had my notebook, and I had the site's academic database, which was a shared terminal system the team used for cross-referencing iconographic finds against the published Çatalhöyük record. 11 years of cataloged material, plus access to the wider J.S. Tor archaeology archive. It should have been enough to at least narrow things down. I started with the basic angular forms. Not the full symbol combination, just the individual components, the hooked verticals, the repeating tripartite clusters, the thing that looked almost like a glyph but wasn't quite any glyph I'd encountered. I ran them separately, got results that were thin but plausible. Geometric incision patterns from level 5, a couple of parallels from Göbekli Tepe's enclosure D. Nothing that matched, but nothing that shut the door either. I wrote down the reference numbers and kept going. Then I tried the combination, the full repeating sequence as it appeared in the columns, the way the symbols stacked and related to each other, the spacing ratios, the directional logic of how they descended. I entered the search parameters, hit the query button, and the system logged me out. Not an error message. Not a timeout. Just logged out. Back to the login screen. Clean and immediate, as if I'd never been in. I logged back in, pulled up the query form again, adjusted the parameters slightly, dropped one symbol from the combination, changed the regional filter, ran it, logged out again. I sat there for a minute. The terminal room was empty. It was mid-morning. Most of the team was in the field, and the room had that particular quiet of a place that's usually occupied. Someone had left a mug on the shelf above the terminal. There was a crack in the plaster above the window that I'd been meaning to note for the maintenance log. I tried 4 more variations over the next 20 minutes. Each one, any query that included the core repeating sequence from Chamber 7 North, produced the same result: instant logout. The system didn't freeze, didn't throw an error, didn't give me anything to work with. It just removed me from the session the moment I asked the right question. I could have told myself it was a glitch, a corrupted search index, some kind of database conflict with unusual character combinations. I'm an academic. I know how to talk myself into a mundane explanation when a mundane explanation is available. But I'd run 40-odd queries that week on everything from pigment analysis to wall plaster composition, and not one of them had logged me out. Only the symbols did that. Only the specific combination from the chamber walls. I closed the terminal and went back to my room. The photographs were still on my phone. I'd been careful not to sync them to anything site-connected, but I had a Durham library account. Everyone at the department did. It gave you remote access to the institutional image archive for comparative work. The idea was straightforward. Upload the images to the archive, flag them as a research query, let the library's system run them against the iconographic databases I couldn't access from here. Durham's system was broader than the site's, and it was 3,000 kilometers away from whatever was happening to the site database. I uploaded 37 photographs. The clearest ones, the full wall sections, the close detail of the symbol columns, 2 comparison shots showing the relationship between the level 12 carvings and the Chamber 7 North inscriptions. I flagged the upload as a symbol identification query and wrote a brief covering note. Standard procedure. I'd done it a dozen times for routine fieldwork. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The number was a Durham landline. I answered it standing outside the accommodation block, which I'd walked to for no particular reason except that I didn't want to be inside when I took the call. "Is this Dr. Jacobs?" The voice was clear, professional, a Southern English accent. "This is Judy Mills from the Durham University Library. I'm calling about an image upload you made to the institutional archive this morning." I said yes, that was me. "Right. So, I'm sorry to bother you, I know you're in the field, but the files you uploaded have been flagged by our IT security system. Automatically, I mean, it's not something I did manually." She sounded slightly apologetic about this, the way people do when they're delivering news they don't fully understand. I'm not entirely sure what triggered it, but the system flagged the images as restricted content, and I've been asked to let you know that you should contact your department chair before doing anything further with the files. I asked her what restricted content meant, specifically. "Honestly, I don't know," she said. "The flag just says to direct you to your department chair. That's really all I have. I'm sorry I can't tell you more." I thanked her and ended the call. I stood outside for a while after that. The plain was flat and gray to the south, the mounds low against the sky. 2 hours. From upload to phone call, 2 hours. Whatever the flag was, it wasn't a slow, bureaucratic process. It was fast, and it was already in place before I'd sent anything, which meant the system hadn't flagged the images because someone reviewed them. It had flagged them because something in the images matched a pre-existing parameter. A pre-existing parameter that somebody, at some point, had set up to catch exactly this kind of content. I did not contact my department chair. Derek Woods had published one paper that mattered to me. 1998, Journal of Near Eastern Studies. a comparative analysis of pre-ceramic symbolic systems in central Anatolia. It was a narrow piece of work, not widely cited, and he'd retired from Bologna a few years after publishing it. That was exactly why I wanted him. He had no active institutional position, no grant funding to protect, no department politics to navigate. He was 74 years old and living in retirement, and if he'd published on pre-Neolithic Anatolian symbols in 1998, he'd spent time thinking about the same stratum I was looking at now. I found his email through a faculty emeritus listing that was 3 years out of date, which meant there was a reasonable chance it still worked. I wrote him a careful message, brief, specific, no speculation. I described the symbol set, included 6 of the clearest photographs as attachments, gave him the approximate depth and the stratum context, and asked if he could identify the system or point me toward anything comparable in the published record. I sent it at 2:30 in the afternoon. His reply came at 8:20 that evening. I was in the common room, not reading anything, just sitting there with a cup of tea that had gone cold. My phone buzzed and I looked at it, and there it was. The message was 4 sentences. Delete the photographs. Do not return to the chamber. I cannot explain further. Please understand that I am not being careless with this. That was it. No analysis, no identification, no reference to anything in the published record, no explanation of what he recognized or why it mattered. Just delete, don't go back, I can't say more. I read it probably 6 times. The thing that kept snagging me wasn't the warning itself. It was the last line. Please understand that I am not being careless with this. That's not how you write to a stranger you think is overreacting. That's how you write to someone you believe, someone whose situation you recognize, when you want them to know the warning is serious without being able to say why. He'd seen the photographs, and he'd written back in 6 hours, and he'd told me nothing except to stop. I called Bologna's retired faculty directory the next morning. It rang 4 times, and a woman answered. Administrative voice, accented English, the kind of tone that means she'd answered the same line 1,000 times. Sky Davidson, Faculty Services. I asked if she could confirm contact details for Professor Emeritus Derek Woods, that I'd been corresponding with him and wanted to follow up. There was a brief pause. I'm sorry, she said. Professor Woods he's not available. He was admitted to hospital 2 days ago. He suffered a stroke. I said I was sorry to hear that. Yes, she said. Is there anything else I can help you with? There wasn't. I put the phone down and sat with it. 2 days ago, Woods had received my photographs, written 4 sentences telling me to stop, and 2 days before that, before I'd even sent the message, he'd had a stroke, or he'd sent the message and then had a stroke. The timing was close enough that I couldn't be certain which way it ran, and I wasn't sure it mattered. What I kept coming back to was Garrett. No room in the accommodation block, no cleared shelf, no stripped bed. A man who had been here before me, working the same site, and who had been removed from the physical record so completely that I'd only noticed because I was looking for the absence. Garrett had been the epigrapher on site before me. He'd been here in this position with access to level 12. And then he was gone, and his name was gone with him. And nobody elaborated on the health matter that had taken him away. Woods had seen the photographs and told me to stop, and then ended up in hospital. Every channel I'd tried, the site database, Durham's library system, Woods, had closed within hours. Not slowly, not through the usual friction of bureaucracy and delay. Fast and clean, and in ways that left me with nothing to work with. I didn't know what had happened to Garrett, but I was starting to think I needed to find out. Cambridge's staff portal wasn't difficult to get into. That's not a brag. It's just that academic institutions run on the assumption that nobody outside the department has any reason to go looking, so the barriers are low. Staff directory, departmental listings, emergency contacts on the faculty profile page. Garrett's was still live. Nobody had thought to take it down, or maybe nobody had thought it mattered. Either way, it was there. Patricia Garrett, Bristol, a mobile number. I sat with the number for about 10 minutes before I called. I didn't know what I was going to say. I still don't know if there was a good version of that call, a way to ring up a stranger and ask about her brother without it sounding like exactly what it was, which was someone who'd been following his footprints into a hole in the ground and wanted to know what had happened to him. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I was an epigrapher at Çatalhöyük, that I'd taken over from her brother in November, and that I was trying to reach him because I'd come across some of his earlier notation work and had a few questions. That was the version I'd settled on. Plausible enough. Not entirely a lie. I had come across his work in a manner of speaking. There was a pause on her end. Not a long one. More like someone who's had to explain something painful enough times that they've found the efficient route through it. "Bernard's not reachable," she said. "He's been in a facility in Oxfordshire since October, private care." I asked if it was a medical matter, which was a stupid question, but I needed her to keep talking. "He stopped being coherent," she said. The word came out carefully, like she'd chosen it specifically because it was accurate without being the worst possible way to say it. "He's not in distress. They tell me he's calm, but he doesn't respond to anything. He doesn't seem to register that anyone's there." I asked what he did do. Another stupid question, maybe, but she answered it. "He talks," she said. "Not to anyone. Not about anything. Just the same thing over and over. 4 sounds. Syllables, I suppose. And then he stops, and then again. They told me it was every 11 seconds. They timed it." I was sitting at the small desk in my room with a notepad in front of me that I hadn't written anything on. I put the pen down. Patricia kept talking for a while after that. The facility, the doctors, the fact that nobody had given her an explanation she could actually use. I listened. I said the things you say. I didn't tell her what I knew, which was that her brother had been in a chamber 4 meters below the current excavation floor and had heard a fissure in the bedrock produce a 4-beat pulse every 11 seconds, and that something in that chamber had followed him out. I didn't tell her that because I couldn't see what it would do for her. Some information doesn't help the person you give it to. It just transfers the weight. I thanked her and ended the call and sat there for a while. 4 beats, 11 seconds. Garrett had been in Chamber 7 North, and the chamber had done something to him that a private facility in Oxfordshire hadn't been able to reverse in 6 weeks. Woods had seen the photographs and ended up in hospital. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was the same shape, twice, with different men, and I was the third epigrapher looking at the same symbols. The thing I kept coming back to was the USB drive. I had the photographs on it, the audio, my partial translation notes. If someone found it, Lloyd Quinn, a maintenance worker who happened to look in the wrong drawer, it was gone, and I was gone with it, and the chamber stayed buried. The longer I waited, the more that risk compounded, and there was something else, something I couldn't quite articulate at the time, but that kept pressing at the back of everything. Whatever was in that fissure wasn't static. It had been there for 15 to 20,000 years, but it wasn't just sitting. It was doing something. And I didn't know how long I had before the doing something changed in a way I couldn't document. So I went back, twice more in the following days, working fast and quiet and without telling anyone. I photographed everything I could reach, every wall panel, every column of symbols, the platform at the center, the fissure itself, the floor where the symbols continued beneath the sediment line. 340 images across all 3 visits, including the first. I cross-referenced angles where I could, photographed the same panels under different lighting conditions, Used my UV lamp until the battery was low enough that I didn't trust it anymore. The pulse was still running. 4 beats, silence, 4 beats. But the interval had changed. On my second return visit, I counted it manually, sitting in the chamber with my back against the far wall and my phone open to a stopwatch. 11 seconds between sequences, same as before. But on the third visit, 4 days later, I counted 9. I did it a dozen times, 9 seconds, consistent. I sat there counting it over and over until I was sure I hadn't miscounted the first time, and then I sat there a while longer because I wasn't sure what to do with that. Something in the fissure was accelerating. That's the plain version. I didn't have a framework for what that meant, and I still don't, not really. But it meant the chamber wasn't just old, it was active. It was changing. And I was the only person documenting it who wasn't actively trying to keep it buried. The fourth visit was when I found out I was wrong about that last part. I came in through the level 12 gap the same way I always had, moved down into Chamber 7 North, and was crossing toward the eastern wall when I heard something from the connecting passage. The narrow cut between 7 North and the adjacent chamber, the site maps called 6 South. Footsteps, measured, unhurried, someone who knew where they were going. I pressed back against the wall and stayed still. Quinn came through the passage and moved directly into 6 South without pausing. She had a UV filter attachment on her camera, the kind you have to order specifically, not standard issue for the site kit, and she went straight to the eastern inscription panels, not scanning, not exploring, but moving to specific sections the way you move to a page you've already bookmarked. She photographed them in sequence. She knew the order. She knew which panels had what she needed. I watched her work for probably 6 or 7 minutes. She didn't hesitate once. Then she crossed the threshold into 7 North. The team had a boundary line, informal, no tape or marker, just an understanding that the northern chamber complex was off limits pending structural assessment. Lloyd had said it twice in briefings. Quinn had been present for both. She stepped over it without breaking stride and moved to the central platform, crouched down, and photographed the worn grooves from 3 angles. Then she stood and looked at the fissure for a moment, not photographing it, just looking. And then she left the same way she'd come in. I stayed against the wall until I couldn't hear her anymore. The device registration rule. That was the thing that landed. Quinn had stood up in a briefing in the first week and told us all to log our personal electronics with the ministry before entering any excavation chamber. Lloyd had called it bureaucratic overcaution, and everyone had moved on. I'd noted it and filed it. But standing in Chamber 7 North with Quinn's footsteps fading up through the passage, I understood what it had actually been. Not a monitoring protocol for what the team might find. A monitoring protocol for how close the team was getting to something the ministry already knew was there. Every equipment inspection that had stopped a dig day short. Every paperwork dispute that had redirected work away from the northern mound. The rerouted schedules, the delayed supply approvals, the 3 separate occasions when a Lloyd-directed trench had been halted, for reasons that never quite resolved. I'd logged all of it as the usual friction between a foreign academic team and a host country bureaucracy. It wasn't. It was interference. And it had been running the whole time. And Quinn had been the instrument of it. And the ministry had known about Chamber 7 North before any of us arrived. Garrett hadn't stumbled onto something new. He'd gotten too close to something that was already being managed. I stood in the chamber for a while after she left. The pulse ran through its cycle. 4 beats, silence, 9 seconds, then again. The satellite terminal had been there the whole time. That's the thing that gets me, even now. I'd walked past the field office every day for 3 weeks, past the little antenna mount on the roof, past the laminated sign on the door that said British Institute at Ankara, Site Operations. I'd noted it the way you note a fire extinguisher. Background. Infrastructure. Not mine to use. I sat in my room after Quinn left the chamber and worked through it properly for the first time. Every channel I'd tried had collapsed within hours. The site database logged me out. Durham's IT flagged the images. Woods had a stroke. The pattern wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't bad luck. It was a system, and the system was monitoring anything that moved through institutional networks. Email, library uploads, academic databases. Quinn couldn't watch what she couldn't see coming, but she didn't need to. The networks did it for her. Whatever arrangement the ministry had with those systems, it was upstream of anything I could root around, except the Iridium terminal. That was the thing. The British Institute had installed it for geological survey data. Atmospheric readings, seismic monitoring, the kind of low-bandwidth transmission that nobody in Ankara would have thought to route through a ministry-adjacent filter because nobody in Ankara thought an epigrapher would be using it to send 340 photographs of a pre-Neolithic chamber at 2 in the morning. I sat with that for a while. Not long, maybe 20 minutes. Then I started compressing files. The field office was a prefab unit at the eastern edge of the accommodation block, maybe 30 meters from my room. I'd been inside twice, once for a site orientation in my first week, once to sign a form about generator usage. The terminal sat on a metal desk in the back corner, a boxy unit with a coiled handset and a small screen showing a steady green uplink indicator. The desk had a laminated instruction sheet taped above it and a USB port on the side panel that I'd noticed during the orientation without registering why I'd noticed it. I noticed things like that. Occupational habit, I suppose. You spend 11 years cataloging objects, and you start treating the world like a site grid. Everything gets logged, most of it filed under not currently relevant. The terminal had been sitting in that category for 3 weeks. I crossed the site at 1:53 in the morning. No torch. I'd walked that path enough times that I didn't need one, and a light moving across the site at that hour would have been visible from the accommodation block windows. The sky was clear, and the plain was flat, and the cold had that specific quality it gets out there in November. Not wet, but absolute. The kind that settles into your joints before you've gone 20 meters. I had the USB drive in my jacket pocket. I had a list of 3 email addresses in my head that I'd memorized and then deleted from my phone. The field office door had a standard PIN code lock. I'd watched Lloyd enter it twice, and the code hadn't changed. I'm not going to write the code down here. Doesn't matter now anyway. Inside, I didn't turn on the overhead light. There was a desk lamp near the terminal that threw a small circle and nothing else, and I used that. The uplink indicator was still green. I connected the drive, opened the transmission interface, and sat for a moment looking at the screen. I want to be honest about what I was thinking right then, not the version where I'd worked it all through and made peace with the consequences, the actual version. I was thinking about Garrett in that facility in Oxfordshire, repeating 4 syllables every 9 seconds, and about Woods in a hospital in Bologna, and about the fact that whatever was in that fissure had been accelerating across my 3 visits and was still accelerating now. I was thinking that the sealed professional answer, go to the authorities, follow the proper channels, trust the institution, had already been tried by at least 2 people before me, and had ended in a hospital room and a locked ward. I was thinking that the USB drive in the port was the only complete record of what I'd found, and that if I walked out of that office without transmitting it, the drive would be found within the week, and the chamber would be quietly managed, and in 6 months there would be no door with my name on it in the accommodation block either. That's my way of saying I wasn't brave about it. I was just out of other options. Teresa Nunez at Hurriyet. I'd found her through a byline search on pre-Neolithic Anatolian coverage, 3 articles in the past 2 years, one of them a piece on ministry interference with a dig site near Göbekli Tepe that had been published and then quietly delisted from the paper's archive. She was 31, based in Istanbul, and she'd already been somewhere close to this story once. That mattered. Kevin Fields at Durham was my department chair, careful, collegial, the kind of man who forwarded things to colleagues before he'd finished reading them. That also mattered, though for different reasons. The archaeology forum was a long shot. The kind of upload that could sit unread for a week or get reposted across a dozen servers by morning. I didn't know which. I sent it anyway. The compressed archive was 412 megabytes, photographs, audio file, partial translation of the level 14 inscriptions, coordinates for Chamber 7 North. I added a plain text document, 3 paragraphs, no more, explaining what the photographs were, where they came from, and what the audio recording contained. I didn't editorialize. I just said what I'd found and where it was, and that the interval between pulses had shortened across 3 visits from 11 seconds to 9. The transmission took 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I watched the progress bar and didn't move. The terminal made a faint cycling sound, a low electronic hum that rose and fell with the data packets. I'd heard that sound before on geological survey nights and never paid it any attention. I paid attention now. When the screen showed transmission complete, all recipients confirmed, I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I disconnected the drive, put it in my pocket, and turned off the desk lamp. I had the door open when I heard the vehicles. 2 of them, coming from the Kanya Road. No sirens, but they weren't running quiet either. The engines were moving at pace, and the headlights swept the far edge of the site before I'd taken 3 steps out of the office. I stopped, thought about running. Didn't. There was nowhere on the Kanya plain to run to at 2 in the morning that wasn't just more plain. I stood at the field office door and waited. They were security personnel, not police. Different insignia, Ministry of Culture markings on the vehicles. 4 of them. One spoke enough English to tell me not to move, which I wasn't doing. Another went straight past me into the field office. I heard him at the terminal for maybe 30 seconds. Then he came back out and said something in Turkish to the one who spoke English. The English speaker held out his hand. I gave him the drive. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in an evidence bag. Very procedural about it. I remember thinking that was almost worse than if they'd been rough. The efficiency of it, the practiced quality. Like this was a thing they'd done before and expected to do again. Teresa Nunes published the article at 7:18 that morning. I know the time because one of the ministry officials who came to take my statement had a phone that buzzed on the table between us, and when he looked at it, his expression changed in a specific way. Not alarmed exactly, more like someone who'd been told a pipe had burst and was now calculating the damage. He excused himself. When he came back, he was on a call in Turkish and stayed on it for 11 minutes by the clock on the wall. The article had the photographs. It had a description of the audio recording and a transcription of the 4-beat sequence. It had the coordinates of Chamber 7 North and a note about the pulse interval shortening. I don't know how she turned it around that fast. She must have been awake when the transmission came in, or she woke up and saw it and understood immediately what she had. Either way, she ran it. The suppression order came through before noon. I found out later from Nunes herself. She called me once, briefly, from a number I didn't recognize before things got complicated for her too. Her editor, Zachary, had been straightforward about it, told her the order had come directly from Ankara, told her the article was coming down, told her there was nothing he could do. She said he'd sounded tired more than anything. Like it wasn't the first time. The article was gone by 11:47. I know that because the official who'd been on the phone came back into the room where I was sitting and his posture had changed. Something released in the shoulders. That particular easing that happens when a problem has been partially managed. Not solved. Partially managed. He sat down across from me and explained the charge. Unauthorized data transmission from a protected UNESCO site. Minimum 2-year legal process under Turkish cultural heritage law. He read it from a printed form, which he then slid across the table for me to sign. I signed it. There wasn't much point in not signing it. Outside the room's small window, the plain was flat and gray and the site was quiet. I sat in the chair and kept my hands on the table and waited to see what happened next. The official left the room around midday and didn't come back for a while. Long enough that I started paying attention to the window. It was a small window, set high in the wall the way administrative windows always are, not to give you a view, but to let in light without giving you anything to look at. I had to stand to see through it properly, and I did that twice before I decided it wasn't worth the effort of pretending I wasn't watching. After that, I just sat with my chair angled toward it and watched. The first vehicle arrived about an hour after I signed the form. White, no markings, Ankara plates. Not a site vehicle. The site vehicles were all mud-colored and had the Project Consortium logo on the doors. This one was clean. That's the detail that stuck. Everything else on the Konya plain was coated in a fine gray dust by November. The accommodation block, the equipment sheds, the wheel arches of every truck that had been on site more than a day. This vehicle was clean. It had come a long way quickly, and someone had thought to wash it before it arrived. 2 more followed it. Same plates, same condition. The workers came out of the northern mound access about 20 minutes later. 6 of them, maybe 7. Hard to count through the window at that distance. They weren't wearing site gear. No high-vis vests, no knee pads, no the layered practical clothing you wear when you're going to spend time underground in a cold chamber. They were wearing what looked like standard-issue coveralls, the kind that don't belong to any particular profession. That's my way of saying they could have been from anywhere. They looked like men who had been told to move things, and that's what they did. The containers were sealed. Gray-green, military-adjacent, with latched lids and handles on both ends. I couldn't tell you what was inside them. I couldn't tell you how many there were. I stopped counting after 8 because counting made it feel like I was doing something, and I wasn't doing anything. I was sitting in a chair watching through a small window while the contents of Chamber 7 North got loaded into 3 clean vehicles with Ankara plates. Whatever the containers held, they were heavy. The workers moved in pairs and didn't hurry, but they didn't set anything down either. That kind of careful, continuous movement that means the weight is manageable, but you don't want to test it. I kept thinking about the stone platform, the grooves in it, the ones worn into the surface by something organic over a span of time I still couldn't quite hold in my head without it sliding away. 15,000 years minimum, probably more. Whatever had made those grooves had been doing it long before the Neolithic settlers built their mud brick houses above it, long before anyone thought to draw a map of this place or assign a stratum number to it. And now it was in a container. Or it wasn't. Maybe they'd left the platform. Maybe it was too heavy or too fixed to move. Maybe they'd only taken the portable things, the things that could be documented and transported and filed somewhere under a classification level I'd never be cleared to see. I didn't know. I still don't. The pulse had been at 9-second intervals on my last visit, down from 11. I thought about that while I watched the vehicles. Something in the fissure was accelerating, and now the fissure was either empty or sealed, or both, and I had no way of knowing whether that made things better or worse, or whether better and worse were even the right categories for whatever was happening down there. Garrett had heard it at 11 seconds and hadn't spoken coherently since. Woods had looked at the photographs and had a stroke within 48 hours. I'd been in the chamber 3 times and transmitted everything I had, and I was sitting in a detention room with a 2-year legal process ahead of me and my hands on a table, and I couldn't decide if that made me lucky or just slower to break. The last container went into the second vehicle around 2 in the afternoon. The workers folded back into the third vehicle without ceremony. No conversation I could see, no looking around, no particular acknowledgement that they'd just emptied a chamber that predated human civilization as anyone formally understands it. They moved like men finishing a job. The vehicles pulled out in a line heading north toward the main road, toward Konya, and within a few minutes the dust from their wheels had settled, and the plain was flat and gray and quiet again, and the northern mound looked like it always had, just a low rise in the landscape, unremarkable. The kind of thing you drive past without slowing down. That was the last I saw of Chamber 7 North. The official came back in the late afternoon with tea, which I hadn't expected. He set it on the table without comment and sat down across from me and looked at his phone for a while. I drank the tea. It was too sweet, but I wasn't going to say so. At some point, I'm not sure when, the light through the window had gone flat and gray. I started thinking about the forum upload. The third transmission, the one I'd almost not included because it had felt redundant at the time. Because I'd already sent everything to Nunez and to Fields, and a third channel had seemed like excess. I'd included it anyway because I'd been standing in the field office at 2 a.m. with the satellite terminal humming and the USB drive in the port and the particular clarity you get when you've already made the decision and you're just executing it. So I'd uploaded the full archive to the public forum and logged out and disconnected the drive and waited for the security personnel from Kanya. The ministry could pressure a publisher. They could call Zachary and tell him the article was coming down and make it clear there was no version of events in which it stayed up, and Zachary, who had sounded tired more than anything, would comply. That's how suppression works when there's a single point of contact. You find the person with authority and you apply pressure and the thing disappears. A public forum doesn't have a Zachary. There's no one to call. By the time the ministry identified the thread, it had already been downloaded by people in 4 countries who had no particular reason to delete it and every reason to find it interesting, because it was interesting. Angular symbols from a stratum that shouldn't exist. Audio of a sub-80 Hz pulse with a 4-beat rhythm. Coordinates, photographs. A partial translation of wall inscriptions that didn't match anything in the established Çatalhöyük record. That's the kind of thing that spreads. Not because people are activists or because they're trying to cause trouble, but because it's genuinely strange and strange things move. Fields had forwarded the archive to 3 colleagues before Nunez's article was even retracted. I found that out later, not in the detention room, but afterward, when things had settled into the long procedural grind of the legal process. And I had time to piece together what had happened while I was sitting in that chair. Fields had opened the email, looked at the photographs, and forwarded it within the hour. His colleagues had done the same. By the time anyone with the authority to intervene had identified the problem, the archive existed in too many places to locate, let alone remove. I'd known that was possible when I sent it. I hadn't known it would happen that fast. The official drove me to Kanya that evening. I sat in the back of a ministry vehicle and watched the plane go dark through the window, the sight receding behind us until the mounds were just 2 low shapes against the sky, and then nothing at all. I didn't look back for long. There wasn't much point. Here's what I know now, sitting far enough from it to talk about it plainly. The archive is out there. It's been translated, debated, contested, dismissed, and taken seriously by people with more credentials than me, and people with none at all. And the argument about what those symbols mean and what that chamber was and what was producing that pulse is ongoing, in the way that arguments about genuinely unresolved things tend to be ongoing, without resolution, without consensus, without any official body willing to confirm or deny what was in those containers or where they went. The ministry never commented on Chamber 7 North directly. They issued a statement about the unauthorized transmission, about the legal process, about the importance of protecting UNESCO-designated sites from unauthorized documentation. They did not mention the chamber. They did not mention the symbols. They did not mention the vehicles with Ankara plates or the workers in unmarked coveralls, or the sealed containers that headed north toward Kanya on a flat gray afternoon in November. Garrett is still in Oxfordshire. I know that because Patricia sends a brief update every few months, not to me specifically, but to a small group of people who've been following the case, and the updates are always the same. He's comfortable. He's receiving care. He still repeats the 4-beat sequence every 11 seconds, regular as a clock, without variation, without stopping. I think about that interval. 9 seconds it was, on my last visit. Down from 11. I think about what 8 would mean, and 7, and whether there's a number at the bottom of that sequence where something changes. And I think about the fact that whatever was in those containers left the site in November and is somewhere now, in some facility I'll never have clearance to enter. And the fissure in the bedrock is still there whether they sealed it or not. The archive spreads. That part I'm certain of. Whatever else is uncertain, and most of it is. That part I know. It's out there. It's already out.